Welcome to The Authority File, the podcast that features conversations about the life cycle of scholarly communication. I'm Bill Mickey, your host and the editorial director at Choice. In this four-part series, which is brought to you with generous support from the Wilfrid Laurier University Press, we're going to be talking about how the arts and the creation of art can support, advocate for, and advance environmental justice and sustainability. Joining me are Alicia French, professor of the history of art and visual culture in the Department of Visual Arts at Brock University, and Amanda White, an artist, scholar, and SSHRC postdoctoral fellow at the Center for Sustainable Curating in the Department of Visual Art at Western University. Together, Alicia and Amanda have co-edited the volume Ecologies in Practice, Environmentally Engaged Arts in Canada, a collection of essays, artwork, poetry, and descriptions of community projects that reveal how art can contribute and extend the scholarship around environmental concerns. It's a book that establishes a central role for the creative arts and the interdisciplinary approach of the environmental humanities. In this second episode of our series, we dig into the book itself and discuss its careful consideration of the terminology of its scholarship, how its chapter organization advances its message, and why the editors chose to focus specifically on the geography and politics of Canada. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the book. You spend some time in your introduction with artistic terminology as it relates to the environment before arriving finally at the phrase, quote, environmentally engaged art. Can you describe sort of your method behind this? Why set it up that way?
Yeah. Sorry, go ahead, Alicia. You can.
Yeah, I was going to say, it's a nice sort of segue when we're talking about, the art historian and thinking about art criticism. And so some of that is, grounding our project in, of course, that work that's come before, that significant work that's come before, acknowledging the important work of the field of sort of art history, environmental art, eco art, thinking about eco art specifically as an established genre, and we talk a little bit about that within sort of Western art history practices, thinking about the methods of environmental art, of eco art, and so our book is sort of acknowledging those histories and the scholarship, the work that's come before, but also we could perhaps see it. I don't want to call it a companion, but a companion to that scholarship in some ways. It's related discourse, but we wanted to think about ecology more so in terms of relationships and thinking about art also beyond the strictly visual, because quite a few of our contributors are not necessarily grounded in the visual arts. And for us, some of those histories are more closely tied to visual art production. So thinking about those relationships and conversations that emerge between these histories. And so environmentally engaged sort of felt like a nice space where it's not strict terminology. We're not proposing new terminology in any way, but thinking about space that can invite creative work that's looking at these relationships, linking the social and the environmental, and then respecting definitions and interpretations of those contributors in our book, right? Who might identify with particular methods or approaches, or who may not.
I think also it's a nod to the practice, like the sort of established genre of socially engaged art. In which, the artist sort of, the work is very social in nature and about social justice and implementing change and those kinds of things. And so bringing, and I should say too, we didn't invent the term environmentally engaged art. It's a term that we came across in some more contemporary writing by a few scholars that talk about work in that way. Anyway, but sort of connecting environment work with the environment to socially engaged practice because of that connection between the environment and the social, and that sort of like interdisciplinary way. Like, you can't just make work about the environment, because the environment and society and social issues are, social justice and environmental justice are linked, right? And so, it acknowledges that in a nice way. And I also think for artists, like a lot of the artists in the volume, myself as an artist too, I don't necessarily want to be sort of like placed under an umbrella. And I think, when we talk about like when artists are sort of like placed under like, oh, you're an eco artist or you're a land art person, like those are sort of tied to certain ideals and time periods and things like that. And so because we were bringing in artists as contributors, we also wanted to leave that space open for artists who may work in a variety of ways, but they also touch on these topics, right? So it's a little more open to the artist's interpretation and feeling, just acknowledging the sort of variety of practices as well. And also that, in terms of like Western art history, like we're in a different moment now. And so, a lot of like the eco art conversations maybe don't bring in some of the social issues that we now talk a lot about in the arts. So it acknowledges that as well. Yeah.
Okay, excellent. Perfect. So looking at the chapter sections, these are all clearly action oriented. So we've got interrupt, witness, replace, and reflect as the four sections that the chapters occupy. How do these signal and support, the overarching thesis of the book, and going back to that term environmentally engaged art? How did those section titles kind of play with that?
Yeah, this was something we sat with for a little bit. I think, and perhaps Amanda, can share some insights into this as well. But the first time we've worked together as sort of co-editors, and so we sat together for quite some time with the pieces, thinking about the connections between them, the relationships between them, but immediately you sort of notice inherently the participatory sort of aspect of many of these works and the active qualities of these works. But defining action in very different ways, I think was significant for us. So there's these really sort of interesting investigations in terms of methodology that are, active in subtle or really sort of overt ways. You think about witness, even for instance, to visualize, imagine something, seemingly invisible, that idea of bearing witness, right? That holds profound sort of action resistance, even though it's seemingly perhaps less so. So someone like Lisa Hermer, for instance, came to mind when I was thinking about witness. That activation of sites that hold tremendous loss that are, is really related to the extinction for her of the passenger pigeon. So activating sort of, these really sort of quiet spaces and these maybe forgotten histories, and to witness and to sort of bear witness on those sites, I think is a really sort of profound, participation and action, in ways that are perhaps more subtle. So just really sort of that thread throughout, thinking about action and what action can do and what it looks like in different ways for artists and creative makers.
And I'll just add that when we conceived of those sections, we also were thinking of it in a bit of a narrative arc. So it starts with interrupt, like to interrupt the status quo, and then to sort of like reimagine through witness, and then replace was sort of like reimagining place or rethinking place, and then reflect was like also then looking inward and like thinking about the artist's own practice and impact. So like reflecting on and also just reflecting on methodology and everything. So if in that sense, it sort of like follows the story of wanting to make change and then trying, like showing these different methods or ways artists can sort of intervene, and then sort of like reflecting on that at the end. So that's kind of how we thought of it, and always with that idea of action, because a lot of the artists are also kind of like there are forms of activism, right, that are happening throughout. So we wanted to honor that and sort of bring that into the sort of framing, even though it's an academic book, it's still like sort of calling to action in a way.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah,
An
absolutely.
invitation.
Yeah, exactly. And yeah, I was going to say that. I mean, you could definitely see sort of that progression through those four sections. So, obviously environmentalism is a global issue, and yet you're very intentionally focusing in your book on the geography and politics of Canada. I mean, can you talk about that focus a little bit?
Sure. I can start, and then Alicia, you can jump in whenever. So I think, as you mentioned, it's a huge topic. There's so many, it affects all life on Earth. It's like the most urgent issue that we all feel, like every living thing on the planet is sort of like facing these crises, right? So like, where do you start?
Yeah.
And so, there's that piece, but then also um, you know, uh, Alicia and I both were interested in thinking about the specificity of working in where we are, from our position, like on the land that we're on, in the time that we're in. There's very specific issues around environment in Canada, and we felt like often these conversations are looking outward, looking to the States or looking at these global issues, and not really like self-reflecting on the way in which like the Canadian quote unquote narrative of self is often like kind of clouded with this like nature, pristine wilderness kind of imaginary, where in reality it's so reliant on extractive industry and land theft, and and in this time as well of truth and reconciliation, like to really think about you know what is our responsibility to the environment, and how can we sort of like reflect on that more. And I think it's important to really look at where you're at, like as scholars we always kind of look outward, and we're very critical of things that are happening elsewhere, but it's so important for us to do the work where we're at, because that's where we can like work with community, right, and actually maybe instigate some change, or and these artists are doing that. Like most of the artists in the volume, they are working in these like really interesting community engaged ways on these very specific issues where they are like really thinking deeply about the places there. And so that felt like the right kind of context to be working on the volume. So Alicia, if you want to add anything to that.
No, that was wonderful. That was lovely. And I mean, you covered a lot of ground there. And I think, yes, environmentalism, thinking about, inequitable lived experiences of climate change, of course, global in scope, but also Amanda and I talked quite a bit about, how exhausting and overwhelming and emotionally heavy thinking about that is. So for us, it's also building, connections between the local and the global in some ways, right? While grounding that work, of course, the book in a very specific context, as Amanda was speaking about, sort of maintaining scope for this project. But in doing so, whether contributors are doing it overtly or not, they draw really beautiful connections between hyper local case studies of community building or community reflection or personal reflection about practice, by considering sort of those connections between environmental justice and social justice. Again, we could go back to Hermer's very site-specific work, right? Activating very specific locales that then become global in scope when we think about extinction, right? Or Christina Battle, I come back to her work often thinking about the work with seed and seed sharing. She has this really close consideration to, growing zones and care for specific seeds and plants. but also reflects on how those seeds move, how those challenge, systems both locally and globally. So although the text is very much so about a, quote unquote Canadian context, it's also global in examination, but there's these lovely moments of really sort of personal, individual reflection that build and share community more broadly.
Yeah, that's well put. Yeah, I mean, some of these examples, while they happen to happen in a local setting, they can happen anywhere in the world, really. I
Yeah.
mean, yeah. You just heard from Alicia French, professor of the history of art and visual culture in the Department of Visual Arts at Brock University, and Amanda White, an artist, scholar, and SSHRC postdoctoral fellow at the Center for Sustainable Curating in the Department of Visual Art at Western University. Alicia and Amanda are co-editors of the recent volume Ecologies in Practice, Environmentally Engaged Arts in Canada, published by Wilfrid Laurier University Press, the underwriter of this series. Join us next week for episode 3 when we continue our conversation about Alicia and Amanda's book and highlight specific chapters that illuminate some of its main themes. We also discuss how art and its creation and messaging fits in with the broader large-scale communication around environmentalism and sustainability. As always, underwriting opportunities for the Authority File podcast are directed by Choice's advertising manager, Pam Marino, and all of our episodes are produced and edited by Choice's digital media producer, Sabrina Kofer, with support from digital media assistant Ashley Roy, who, for this series, contributed some of the interview questions. That's all for this week. Thanks for joining us.